The things God considered sin in the Old Testament are often strange to us today, and many of the laws would even be labeled barbaric or unjust by any civil person. For example, if a son or daughter hit their father or mother, they were to be promptly stoned to death. And he who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. But there were other laws that today sound equally foreign. One class of laws that fall into this category involves the concept of becoming unclean. In God's eyes, to become unclean was a sin, and there were seemingly countless ways to become unclean. Touching anything unclean was one way to become unclean, but the critical aspect of becoming unclean for our purposes is the fact that to become unclean was a sin, as we shall see in the following verses. Or if a person touches any unclean thing, he also shall be unclean and guilty. Or if he touches human uncleanness, whatever uncleanness with which a man may be defiled, and he is unaware of it, when he realizes it, then he shall be guilty. And it shall be, when he is guilty in any of these matters, that he shall confess that he has sinned in that thing. And he shall bring his trespass offering to the Lord for his sin which he has committed, a female from the flock, a lamb or a kid of the goats, as a sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him concerning his sin. The words sin, guilty, and trespass appear 8 times in the above 4 verses, and are the same Hebrew words used to denote sin elsewhere in the Old Testament. This leaves no doubt that becoming unclean wasn't just a matter of hygiene. It was a sin. The words sin and guilt appear throughout most of the passages of the Old Testament regarding uncleanness. What about someone with leprosy? Did God consider lepers to be unclean? It is a leprous disease. When the priest has examined him, he shall pronounce him unclean. If the eruption has spread in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy. Now the leper on whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn, and his head bare, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. Finally, we now have enough background information to see the problem with perfect clarity. Any Jew bound by the Mosaic law, as Jesus would have been, and as he explicitly claimed to have been, who touched anything unclean, including someone with leprosy, became unclean, and in so doing, committed a sin. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. Jesus, in touching the leper, made himself unclean, which, as we've already seen, was considered a sin according to the law. There were many other ways to become unclean. Whoever touches the dead body of anyone will be unclean for 7 days. It did not matter whether the act was intentional or not, and this commandment was not restricted to any group of people, such as high priests. It applied to all Israelites. Even by simply being in the presence of a dead body, one could become unclean. This is the law when a man dies in a tent. All who come into the tent and all who are in the tent shall be unclean 7 days. Here we have a clear depiction of how important it was for the Israelites to avoid dead bodies. Simply going into a tent or closed-in area that contained a dead body made one unclean, which we now know was a sin. While Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But was the girl truly asleep or in some coma-like state? Jesus used this same figure of speech before he raised Lazarus from the dead. After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but the disciples thought he meant natural sleep. In fact, the word sleeping or asleep was a common euphemism for the state of being dead. Paul uses this same figure of speech in several of his letters to denote death. "For this we say unto you by the word of the Lord, that we which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord shall not prevent them which are asleep." After that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. Let's continue examining the rest of the miracle. But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. Some may want to argue that the girl was merely in a coma, or a paralyzing condition, and that Jesus was using the term asleep to mean a suspended state of consciousness, and that he had not put himself in the presence of a dead body at all. There are a few problems with this explanation. One, the euphemism asleep was used by Jesus himself when referring to Lazarus, and it is quite consistent to think he would use it again when referring to another dead person such as Jairus' daughter. Two, the miracle would lose its effect on the readers if it was a mere healing, since the readers would assume she was really asleep and not dead, since the concept of a coma is a modern one. And three, more importantly, the Gospel of Luke puts all doubt aside as to whether the girl was truly dead. But he put them all outside, took her by the hand and called, saying, "Little girl, arise." Then her spirit returned, and she arose immediately. Jesus not only entered an enclosed room with a dead body, but touched a dead body, both actions strictly forbidden by the laws concerning uncleanness.